Hey guys, I'm Mark. Today I want to do a video about how to grow citrus trees in a container and how to care for them properly, at least how we do here at our nursery. Here at the nursery, we grow everything in pots. We don't grow anything in the ground and dig it up and sell it to people. Everything that we sell is grown in a pot, so we're pretty accustomed to things being in containers. Some of these trees that we're working with at the nursery are over 30 years old. We've got a bunch of them around. We've even got some that are 15, this is about 15 to 20 years old. This is a Meyer lemon. The different ones that we've got out here today are, like I say, a Meyer lemon. This one is another Meyer lemon, and yet again a Meyer lemon. This one came from my friend Carrie. This one was a gift from my friend Andre. And then behind us here is a standard orange. I'm not sure exactly what the variety is, but this one's a 30-year-old tree. It was grafted onto a rootstock. And this right here is a grapefruit tree. Again, it was grafted, and it's got another buddy over there on the back side that you probably can't see, a regular lemon. We also have a lime here on the property. But the benefits to growing your own citrus there's several of them. Number one, the taste. The flavor of lemons or limes or any kind of citrus that you grow yourself is just exceptional, especially for somewhere like where we are in Maryland. We don't live down south. We're not in Georgia or Florida. So all the citrus that we ever get comes from either Florida or California. But when you grow it yourself, the flavor is just amazing. It's unbelievable. The fragrance is unbelievable. And then even when you slice into the fruits themselves, they're just so incredibly juicy. The texture is almost entirely different. So you've got that. You've also got the fact that, you know, growing your own citrus is not like growing other things where you get one big harvest and you have to pick it all at once and use it or you lose it. Citrus, you can leave it on the plant for a really long time. In fact, that is the best way to store it. Sometimes they'll just hang on the tree fully ripe for a couple months in certain situations. And you just leave them on there until they fall off on their own accord. And once they do that, you are going to want to pick them off the ground. But then you can put them in bags, put them in the refrigerator, and they'll last that much longer. So that's another huge benefit. And then on top of that, I mean, if you're just going to grow it for the blossoms themselves, I mean, the fragrance of these blossoms is pretty much the best thing ever. Unbelievable. If you never smelled that before, you're really missing out. But the blossoms and then it just being such a pretty plant. So what we'll go over today is some Meyer lemons. I got a couple Meyer lemons here that I'm going to pot up, and I'm going to pot them up and just go over a few things that you're going to want to consider when potting them up. They're a relatively easy plant to grow. Like I said, we grow a lot of different things in containers, so the lemons to us seem to be relatively easy to grow in a container, but there's still certain things that you're going to want to look at and paying attention to when you're trying to pull this off. And whether it be the pot size, the pot type, whether you're using plastic or clay, or the soil that you're using, whether you're using a standard potting soil or a more coarse soil like this, it all pretty much revolves around one key concept. And that concept is citrus trees do not like to have their feet kept wet. They don't like to be bone dry, but they don't like to be wet. And if they are wet, they don't like to stay wet. So the first thing that you're going to want to think about when you're deciding your pot or your soil is you're going to want to think about where are you and where is this plant going to live? What part of the country, what part of the world are you in? Are you in somewhere like Arizona or Nevada where you have these long, hot, dry days without a cloud in the sky and you've got a breeze? Or do you live somewhere like here in Maryland where our days are humid, they're muggy, there's not a whole lot of air movement? And then not just your outside climate, but your indoor climate as well. Do you bring your citrus trees indoors over the wintertime? If you do, what's the climate like inside of your house? Do you have forced air heat, where you've got hot air blowing out your vents and the humidity is like next to nothing? Or do you have like hot water or steam radiators? So you want to think about those kinds of things. So if I'm in a very dry area, let's say, then I'm probably going to want to use a pot that's got some size to it, something that's going to hold on to that moisture a little bit longer. I might also, if I'm in a really dry climate, want to use a plastic pot because clay pots are porous. They're going to breathe, they're going to dry out quicker. And then also the soil type. If I'm in a dry climate, then I might want to use like a standard regular potting mix. Whereas me, here in Maryland, where it's very humid, smaller is going to be better in terms of pot size. Clay, you can use clay. It's not entirely necessary, but clay is going to further assist with drying things out. And then the type of soil that we're going to use and that we like to use a lot here in our climate is what we call perennial soil. It's a much coarser mix. It's got a lot of bark and shredded wood and things like that in there. So it dries out faster. We call it perennial mix because perennials prefer to grow in this, we find, over a standard potting soil. But once you figure out what you're going to wind up using, then you're going to wind up going ahead and starting to plant. So for today's video, we're going to plant up this Meyer lemon tree, and I'm going to plant it in this pot. And you can see that a small pot winds up being better. I mean, this tree, it's not perfect. It's sat outside all winter. It's had some things munching on it, but it's still pretty healthy considering how tiny of a pot that it's remained in. But we're going to give it a little bit of a larger pot. In this case, a clay pot. Most everything that we grow here at our nursery, we keep in plastic pots. And that's not so much because they like or prefer plastic, the plants themselves. It's more so a practicality type thing. I mean, this is a working nursery. We have forklifts driving around. We have shopping carts. These plants get moved around a lot. So just for us to have most things kept in plastic, it just makes more sense. I would say that the only advantage to using plastic over a clay pot in terms of the plant being more healthy is the fact that plastic pots usually have more holes in the bottom. And not only do they have more holes for drainage, but they also, the way that they're molded, sometimes plastic pots will sit up off the ground. You can see that there's that divot there, and some of these holes are actually elevated up above the surface. So if this pot's just sitting on a table, it has room to sort of drip out and it won't just clog up as much. So that is one advantage. But today we're using a clay pot, excuse me, because I don't rarely ever hardly get to use these, and I just thought it'd be a little bit more fun. But one thing that most clay pots do have going against them is they usually only have one hole at the bottom. And that's a very important thing to pay attention to, because if you have more holes on the bottom, you have a greater margin of error. This only has one hole, so if that gets clogged, it could cause problems. What I like to do in situations like this, and really any situation where I'm potting something that is particularly special, is I like to put gravel in the bottom of my pots. Normally I would just kind of shake some in here, but because it's clay, I'm probably just going to kind of slide some in there so that I don't crack it or bust it. But the layer of gravel just sort of acts like a screen and a filter. It allows the water to come down through the soil and then just kind of filter out before it makes it to that hole. You're always going to want to check on that hole periodically, I will say, because in certain situations we have, for example, these very large lantana here at the nursery. And every year we like to tip them over on their sides, and we'll take a drill with a 1/2-inch drill bit on it, and we'll drive it up through the holes and just kind of spin out a lot of the roots that are in there, because sometimes the roots will actually grow and bind up and they'll clog up the holes themselves. So that's always something that you want to pay attention to, is make sure that hole is free and clear so that it can actually do its job. So now that we've got the gravel in there, we'll go ahead and put some soil in. This again is our regular perennial soil. It's nice and coarse. Now, on the consumer market, you're probably not going to be able to find something that's necessarily called perennial soil. It's probably easier to search for orchid, or not orchid, cactus and succulent mix is probably a lot more similar to what this is. Orchid mix would be almost entirely bark. But if you mix orchid mix with regular potting soil, you might get a consistency that's fairly similar to this. But I think, again, in my purpose in a humid climate, this is going to work out well. So I'm going to fill the pot up, make a little divot in there, kind of like that. I'll go ahead, take this guy out. It's not entirely necessary to do, but you can sort of rough up the roots a little bit if you so desire. And then plant it in there. And then just kind of filling around the edges like normal. The main thing when you're potting up a plant like this is just to make sure that the crown, basically where the roots turn into stem, is elevated above the rest of the surrounding soil. Now that goes for whether you're putting stuff in a pot or in the ground, doesn't matter. Just always make sure that crown is up above the soil. It's especially important in a situation where you have a grafted plant. These Meyer lemons are not grafted because they tend to grow really well in pots as they are. Their roots just work out fine. Some larger lemon varieties do better grafted to a different type of rootstock that's more conducive to growing in a pot. If that's the case, you're going to notice a scar down below where that graft was made, and you always want to make sure that graft is above the surface of the soil. Another thing you want to look for if you have a grafted tree is below that scar that's on the tree, and this goes for when you're planting it, it goes through all the way through. You want to keep an eye on where that scar is and if there's any suckers or if there's anything budding up out of beneath that scar, because what that is the rootstock is sprouting out. It wants to become a tree again. And you have to really pay attention because the rootstock leaves, any citrus trees leaves will pretty much look indiscernible from one to the next. And if you're not paying close attention, what you'll get is you're not going to notice until you actually have fruits coming out on your plant and you're going to say, well, that's not a Meyer lemon. What is that? Well, it was the rootstock grew up and overtook the plant. So always something to pay attention to there. Lastly, you just want to make sure that, that you don't overfill your pot with soil. Leave enough room that when you come through and water this, that the water's not just running over the edges of the pot. You can come through with a pitcher and fill this up mostly and it'll be done and taken care of. Another thing I want to mention about the soil that I'm using, this is an important thing to address, is we always use sterile soil. It's inert. It doesn't have any of like the preconditioned nutrients or fertilizers already in the potting mix. You can use that, that's fine, but be careful because we have had a lot of customers here at the nursery that talk about using pre-fertilized soils at their home, especially with houseplants, and they have issues where the plants get burnt. So in our case, what we always use is inert soil, and we add all of the fertilizer ourselves, and I'll kind of get to that here in a little bit. But once you've got these guys planted up and potted up, then the next thing you're going to want to think about is your location. Where is this plant going to live? Again, you want to take into account what part of the world you're in, especially are you going to be bringing this plant inside during the wintertime like we do, or are you somewhere like down south where you can leave it in a pot outside year round? That's going to be a big thing. Another big thing is how hot it gets. If you're going to be planting, if you're going to have your plant outside during the summertime or whenever, do you live in an area where it's super dry? Again, like Nevada, Arizona, it's dry, it's hot, you've got the sun beating down all day long. In a situation like that, I would want to place this plant somewhere where it gets the morning sun, but then it gets a little bit of a break later on in the day. Either it gets, the sun goes behind some trees and you get some shade or even some filtered light. That's just going to be a little bit less stressful on the plant. But here in Maryland, where most of our days are they're either sunny or they're cloudy or they're rainy, or it's a mix of all that, and especially the humidity, it's humid almost all the time, then you can get away with putting this out in full-blown, full-blast sun. Park it outside somewhere like this, and these guys will be just fine. But when you bring them in, if you're going to bring them in, one thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that it gets as much light as possible indoors. Place it in your house wherever it is the most well lit, whether you have a sunroom, if you have a south-facing window, that's great. Just make sure you rotate it a little bit so that your plant doesn't grow all lopsided towards the sun. But that's fine. If you don't have quite enough light in your house, then you can supplement with additional light. And what I mean by that is grow lights, electric grow lights. There's a lot of LED products on the market right now. You don't have to necessarily get one of those grow light cabinet thingies that, I mean, you can use one of those, like something that you would use to start your seeds with. But I think that if you want something a little bit more appealing or aesthetically pleasing, then you certainly have a lot of options there. Grow lights, especially now, they're LEDs and they come and you can get the actual bulbs that are the right spectrum for plants to thrive. And you can put those bulbs anywhere. You can put them up in the ceiling in your recessed cans. You can put them in whatever fixture you want. I will say it is helpful to have a fixture that's adjustable. So if you have like those gooseneck type floor lamps where you can kind of raise and lower the light to get it closer to the plant, basically the closer that light bulb is to the plant itself, the more efficient you're going to be in terms of your electric usage for making this guy happy. Personally, I really like the pendant lights. I like the pendant lights that are like those old style Tiffany stained glass kind of pendant lights on the chain. I just think they're kind of nifty looking, especially when you bring houseplants into the picture, but that's just me. I'm not going to tell you how to decorate, but I can tell you do have a lot of options as far as lighting is concerned. So that's lighting. Temperature is not, there's not really a whole lot behind that. I mean, they like it where we like it for the most part. They don't like it in the blazing, super hot sun like I talked about. If they're going to be in the hot heat during the summer, then like I said, give them a break with a little bit of shade in the afternoon. Don't let them sit out in that all day long. When it comes to the winter time and bringing them in the house, I'll say what we do is, well, our greenhouses during the winter time stay at about 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. And then at nighttime, they'll get down to, we don't like to let them get much below 50 degrees Fahrenheit at nighttime. So that's where we keep them. If you want to let them get a little cooler than that, that's fine. Like if you have an outdoor sunroom with single pane glass and it gets kind of cold in there, that's fine, but just kind of watch it, because if your standards are, well, it gets cold in there, I mean, but it never freezes, well, then that's too cold. I mean, they're not going to like it in mid-30s. That's just a little bit too chilly for them. They'd be better off if you bring them in the house with the rest of the family and just turn up the lighting on them a little bit. So that's temperature, that's lighting. Water, as far as water goes, again, that's probably the most crucial aspect of all of this. The best way to tell when your plant needs water is not by time. Don't just water it on a schedule. In the heat of the summer, when you have it drying out very quickly, then you might want to water it every day. Like in a case like ours, if it's this little tiny pot sitting outside, or this little, where was it? It was in this pot outside during the day. This was drying out almost to the bone every day. So we'd water it every day. But for the most part, you don't want to go on a schedule. You want to go on when the plant is ready to be watered. Now, again, they do not like to sit wet. Wet is a huge no-no with these guys. They don't like to be bone dry either, but they can afford to get a little bit droopy, especially if you have new growth on them and you see them start to flag or wilt just a little bit. That's fine. It's better to be on that side of things. The only exception would be, I would say, is when these plants are flowering and when they're fruiting. When they're flowering, if you get them too dry and you get them too stressed out, then they might lose their blooms, which is going to affect your harvest, the next one coming up, obviously. And then when they're setting fruit, you'd like the moisture level to be a little bit more consistent as that fruit is developing. But other than that, they just kind of like to be on a cycle of dryish back to moist, to dryish back to moist. And that goes for a lot of things, really, but citrus especially are pretty temperamental as far as that goes. I did want to mention, because this kind of ties into the cycle, when you plant these guys, the timing that you're planting them, and how water ties in. You'd like to plant most anything in a period right before it starts to grow or while it's actively growing. Because if this plant is about to go into dormancy, then you're not going to want to upgrade the pot, because it's just going to sit in this damp soil surrounding the root ball, and it's never going to really dry out. Those roots are not pulling moisture out of that soil actively. So it's just going to kind of sit there in a damp environment and it might rot out. So it's a good thing to just plant these guys when they're actively growing. Here, where we are in Maryland and having a greenhouse, they don't ever really truly go into dormancy. This plant is kind of cycling through some stage of its life at any given point in time. So I can go ahead and plant it now. I feel perfectly comfortable with doing that. Ideally, I would probably want to do what I'm doing right now sometime in the spring before it starts flushing out with all its new growth. But having a nursery, planting up stuff like this takes a little bit more time than you think, or it's a little more difficult to get around to than you would imagine, especially if you're going to be making a video about it. So I'm planting this guy right now and he'll be just fine. But yeah, water, huge deal. Just water them when they need it. A good way to tell is we always like to lift things. If you don't lift your plants and gauge by the weight, it's a good time to start. Never too late to start. Just give it a little bit of a tip. You'll gauge, you'll learn pretty quickly what to feel for, what it feels like when it's light, what it feels like when it's wet. Great way to judge. You can also kind of shove your fingers down and sort of pull some of the soil aside. And if you see it's bone dry all the way down an inch or two, well, then it's probably time to give it some water. But watering, certain times of the year, it's going to be some more, like I say, when the plant's actively growing, it's going to use more water. When it's dormant, it's going to use a little bit less. Same thing, we'll go into fertilizing. If you're using water-soluble fertilizer, when the plant is actively growing, that's a good time to feed it. If your plants are dormant, if you live in a part of the world like down south, where you're leaving your lemon trees outside and they're going to go dormant, fertilizing is probably not a good idea, because what you're going to do is you're going to stimulate new growth to come out of that plant. And if you've got new growth coming out in November and you have a really cold spell, let's say it gets down to freezing or close to it and you have a frost, well, then that new growth will get burnt and you're opening the plant up to a whole bunch more different kinds of issues at that point. But if you're putting them inside your house or inside a greenhouse like this where it's sort of semi-dormant or not entirely dormant, then you can give it a fall or a winter dose of fertilizer. It's not going to hurt. People like to use slow release granular fertilizers. You can get fertilizers that are specifically meant for growing citrus. Now that applies to granular ones, slow release, or liquid fertilizers. That's fine. We don't use a specific fertilizer for citrus. We use a water-soluble blue fertilizer across the board for everything that we grow here at the nursery. And the reason why we like water-soluble fertilizer is because it's available to the plant. We have a lot more control. So if the plant starts showing a little bit of issues, we can address them very quickly. That fertilizer gets all the way down, envelops the root ball. It's accessible to the plant right away. So that's a handy thing to have. If you do choose to use a water-soluble fertilizer, it's probably going to say on the back of the direction panel, use once or twice a month or every couple weeks or something like that, and it'll give you a rate. That's fine, that's cool. What we do is a little bit different. Well, it's very different. We actually use a very small level of fertilizer, a very low parts per million, almost all the time. Pretty much every other time we water, there is fertilizer coming through the line. It's just at a very small rate. And we'll do that constantly, except for just one exception. Every once in a while, I'd say maybe once a month or so, we will switch to clear water for a while, just in an effort to flush out the salts. Because what you'll have with a lot of salt-based fertilizers is eventually those salts are going to build up in your soil, and that can cause problems with the plant later on. So if you can flush the salts out periodically with just regular clear water, then that's just what we do. And it works well for us because we've got everything on the same schedule. We fertilize the citrus trees the same time as we fertilize the ficus trees that we have, or the bay laurels. They're all pretty much on the same schedule. So not a whole lot of difference there. So that's watering, fertilizing. Oh, I did want to say another benefit to water-soluble fertilizer is that when I was mentioning targeting, like if the plant shows you that it wants some fertilizer, one way you can tell is if the older leaves start to show some yellowing in them. If the older leaves start to show yellowing, that's typically indicative that the plant is nitrogen deficient. Ow, these do have spines, by the way. So when the plant is in poor soil conditions or it doesn't have enough nutrition, what it'll do is it'll start to harvest nutrition out of its older leaves. It'll recycle its nutrients. So the older leaves will start to turn yellow, and then eventually they'll fall off. So that's a good indicator that you need to supply these guys with a little bit of fertilizer, and liquid fertilizer especially is going to help you tackle that right away. Conversely, if you're seeing some yellowing in the leaves on the newer growth, then that's typically chlorosis, which if you start seeing that, then the very first thing that you're going to want to do is tip your pot over and check and make sure that your drainage hole is not clogged, because typically chlorosis is triggered by having things too wet. Either you're overwatering or your drainage hole is clogged. So check on that. If everything looks pretty normal, then the issue could just be a nitrogen deficiency. A lot of times that's what it is. So you can go ahead and hit it with some liquid nitrogen amendments, and then in a couple weeks, some liquid iron amendments. Did I say nitrogen? I meant iron. Hit it with some liquid iron amendments, and that'll go ahead and turn that around for you. But that's fertilizing. And then the last thing to pay attention to with these guys are pests. Typically the pests that you're going to see on citrus trees will be aphids, mealybugs, spider mites, scale. Typically we have mealybugs and spider mites are the number one things that we'll see, and we'll typically see them in the wintertime. Now, as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. At least that's what they say here in the United States. So the way that a lot of these insects work is they usually don't just find their way into your house and then colonize a otherwise perfectly healthy plant that you have sitting in there. Where these insects typically come from is they will land on your plant, maybe in very small numbers, while the plant is outside. And then you're just not going to notice it. The plant's doing really well like this. Oh, well, it looks great. I'll just carry it into the house and I'll set it up in its spot for wintertime. What a lot of people don't do is look for any tiny little issues. You want to check very carefully to see what's going on before you do that, because a lot of times you might just have a couple resident little bugs on there, or some egg clusters or something like that that you wind up carrying inside, And then those egg clusters, they hatch, and then those bugs multiply, and then you don't really realize fully that you have an issue until sometime late winter, like in February or something like that. And then you've just got a full-blown infestation. So as I said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So what we will do before we bring these guys inside is, the best first thing to do to start off with is hose your plants down really well. Take your nozzle off of your hose and just use your thumb and get a really good pressure, get a really good water pressure, and just spray the heck out of your plants. Get the undersides of the leaves, just drench them really, really well. And that's gonna knock off most egg clusters, most of the bugs, even dead leaves and certain things that you just don't want hanging on there. It'll knock a lot of that off. That's a good place to start. Let it dry out, then go ahead and hit it with your horticultural spray. If you have neem oil or horticultural oil or insecticidal soap, give it a, same thing, a really good drench. Coverage is essential. You want to hit the undersides of the leaves, the top sides of the leaves, everything, the entire plant. You want it dripping with whatever you're going to be spraying on it. Now that's, if you're using neem oil and things like that, a lot of people say they'll wait and they'll keep it in a spray bottle, and over the course of the winter, they'll just kind of mist the plant once over, all over. They'll do that several times. Well, it's all natural, you know, I can keep spraying it, what's it gonna hurt? What you don't think about is a lot of these sprays, they leave behind a residue, and that residue is gonna clog up the pores on the undersides of the leaf. Those are the stomata, that's what the leaf uses to breathe. So if you're clogging those pores up, then that plant's not gonna be able to pass air and water through as easily as it normally would. So the better way to do it is just soak it down, make sure you kill anything that's on there right off, and then give it another week. A week later, come back, hit it with your spray again, give it a nice good drench. That's gonna kill anything that might have just got left behind. Let it dry out, and then bring it into the house for winter. So that's my video, guys, on our citrus trees, how to plant them up, how to take care of them, excuse me. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do, because that helps my videos out greatly. It gets them up on the ladder in the scheme of things, gets them in front of more eyes, and that just helps out the channel a lot as a whole. But for now, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. I'll see you next time.